Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. My book, which I seem to have lost already, it's about a phenomenon that's very widespread and I believe profoundly damaging, both for our foreign policy and for our affairs in Britain. And that's a phenomenon of liberal-minded people, left-minded people going along with, making excuses for, apologising for, sometimes openly supporting the movements and ideas of the far right. Now, as this is a somewhat unusual argument, I mentioned it on the BBC last week, and I think it's the first time in 5 years anyone who relies on the BBC for news has ever come across it. I'll quickly take you through a couple of vignettes which happened at the time my book came out, about 6 weeks ago. Just to sort of ease you in, and perhaps we can get some debate going a bit later. The first came from Martin Amis, who he was a friend of Salman Rushdie's, and so had to confront radical Islam long before a lot of us did, long before a lot of us have, we can use the present tense. He's also been abroad, he's also been living in South America for a couple of years, and when you return from abroad, you often see your country with a foreigner's eye. You see things that perhaps those of us who are stuck in the thick of it don't notice. And the Independent said to him, Martin, what shocked you most about Britain since you came back? And Amy said, well, the first thing was seeing a lot of fat, white, middle-aged people waddling through London, carrying banners saying, we're all Hezbollah now. And Amy said, well, you know, enjoy being Hezbollah while you can, because Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, has said of the West, we want nothing from you, we want to eliminate you. Then he described how you might just say, oh well, that's just the far left, it's just Trotskyists going from far left to far right, these things happen. But then Amos said he went on the thoroughly mainstream Question Time, which is watched by, I suppose, the entire politically literate population of this country, you know, if not every episode, at least most. And a woman in the audience stood up and made the following argument. She said that because the United States had supplied the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden, when they were fighting the Afghan communists in the Soviet Union, the correct response to the bombing of New York and of Washington was for the US Air Force to bomb itself, to bomb its own country. And Amy said with obvious astonishment, he said, and the audience applauded. And he said, it takes some doing, you know, when you're confronted with a tidal wave around the world, a tidal wave of religious fanaticism that is homophobic, misogynist, totalitarian and racist, and people in Britain are up the backsides of it. They're up the backsides of those who want them dead. I'm actually used a rather stronger word than backsides, but as this is a genteel literary festival, I'll have to leave that to your imagination. Now, about the same time Amos was speaking, Ken Livingstone, the mayor of my hometown of London, was organising a conference with the apocalyptic title of The Clash of Civilizations. I was invited to speak. I didn't go because I've had it with that crowd of people, and I know the form. These meetings are assiduously rigged, the panel's rigged, the audience is all from the same opinion, and there's always a stooge brought in from the outside whose job is to be abused and condemned fairly or not. But friends of mine did, the political editor of the New Statesman, columnists on the Times, the head of Index and Censorship, all conventionally left-wing people, good people who sort of believed in Livingstone, and they were just stunned by it all. They were stunned by what was said about the 7/7 bombings, and you can find their comments all over the internet. But it actually took a French feminist, Agnès Poirois, from the Republican, secular French tradition to spot what was wrong. And she said, hold on a second, there are no special facilities for Christians here, or for Jews, or for Hindus, but there are special prayer rooms for Muslims. And to make matters worse, there's a man's prayer room and a woman's prayer room. You know, I'm out of here, this is sexism, this is segregation. Is that what Ken Livingstone believes in? Well, yes, it is, to an extent, for people with brown skins, not for people with white skins, people with brown skins. He and many people in the left-wing press in London have allied themselves in Muslim Brotherhood. Livingstone constantly promotes Yusuf al-Qaradari, who believes in female circumcision. wife beating, as long as it's done gently, the killing of Israeli children as legitimate target, the killing of homosexuals, the killing of any Muslim man or woman who does what each and every one of us in this room is entitled to do and abandons the religion they were brought up in, or to make matters worse, decides there is no God, and gives up on religion completely. Now, al-Qaradawi is interesting for this reason. There is a very brave, very beleaguered band of Arab liberals, Arab socialists, who just are having the most appalling time. On the one hand, they've got authoritarian states which are out to get them. On the other hand, they've got radical Islamists which are out to kill them, more often than not if they speak out of turn. But they have 2,500 Arab intellectuals have banded together and petitioned the UN about preachers of hate, preachers who threaten their very lives for saying what you and I can say, threaten our freedoms, which I think we sometimes take too much for granted. And they've petitioned the UN about these preachers of hate, and top of their list is al-Qaradawi. So Livingston is making, and a lot of the left in London are making, a positive choice. Rather than support liberals, feminists, socialists, people in the Arab world who have every right to expect the support of Livingston, he is choosing the extreme theocratic right. Now, here's what makes this a little bit more than a local story. If you read the national press, listen to the BBC, listen to Channel 4 News, you will everywhere hear Ken Livingstone described as the left-wing mayor of London. I imagine if I was to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to name the most senior left-wing politician in Britain, some of you might say Ken Livingstone. It now seems to be the definition of being left-wing, is to go along with movements and ideas of the far right, as long as they're anti-Western. You know, if we're talking about the BNP or native far-right parties, that's fine. That's fine. We can handle those. It's as long as they are anti-Western. Now, some conservative critics, not all by any means, have given my book good reviews, and I'm not complaining. Frankly, you want the dubious pleasure of making a writer your friend for life, all you have to do is give him or her a good review and we'll follow you around forever like a dog. But they do seem to rather miss the point of what I'm trying to say. In the 20th century, it seemed to me, I don't know if the same thing seemed to Christopher, that those of us on the left, we had some kind of hierarchy. At the top was socialism, which was democratic or totalitarian, constantly argued about, like the kingdom of God, never came. The next stage down was what we've got, liberal democracy, mixed economy, a welfare state, actually far more valuable than perhaps people like me and Christopher thought when we were younger. And at the very bottom is fascism, sectarianism, ethnic hatred, religious hatred. It was one thing for people on the left to go along with the Soviet Union or go on CND marches where we didn't really like to think very much about the Soviet Union. I understand how people do that. I understand how that happens because somehow or other we managed to convince themselves they were still left-wing. It is quite another for people to go along with movements to the far right. That seems to me to be tearing up the basic achievements, the hard-won knowledge of liberals and leftists from after 1945. It also seems to me to be fantastically morally disreputable because those Arab liberals and socialists and feminists who petition the United Nations, who put their own lives at risk to argue for democratic and Enlightenment values, what happens to them? Well, what happens to them is one of the most common spectacles, most under-recorded spectacles in the modern world. You saw it with Kurdish socialists who ended up talking to the Pentagon. You can see it, Christopher wrote very recently about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is savaged by liberal intellectuals. And frankly, the only safe home she can find is with the American Enterprise Institute, a very free market and, in conventional terms, very right-wing think tank in Washington. Now, there's a sort of meme, to use, as I'm in Oxford, I will better use Dawkins' words. There's a meme going around about my book that says, oh, Nick, look what Nick's done. You know, if you attack the liberal intelligentsia in London, this great squawking comes up, and this great effort to pretend that we're always okay, that we're always sane, we're always rational, we always are doing the decent thing. And they say, oh, well, yes, okay, Nick's just highlighted, people on the fringe, the leaders of the anti-war movement, leaders for respect. Well, first of all, if anyone's read my book, that's simply not true. There's vast amounts about what's happened to liberal mainstream. But the second thing is, this is very comforting, because if the far left, or the far right, or whatever you want to call it these days, if they are actively working for the enemies of people who want freedom and feminism in the Arab world, the liberal mainstream doesn't have the guts to actually come out against all of that. It just ignores them, blanks them out, refuses to treat them with equality of respect, refuses to give them a hearing, even if they are, even if they disagree with them. Just because someone calls themselves liberal, it doesn't mean they have your support. They automatically have your support, but you ought to at least treat them as an equal. If you doubt me, go back to that question time audience that Amos mentioned. I know Labour ministers have told me they remain astonished. The thing that absolutely sent fear to their hearts was when Hilary Benn, very decent minister, went on Question Time with Piers Morgan, who, again, this is a genteel literary festival. I don't know quite how to describe Piers Morgan. The nicest way to put it is a Burke, and a very satisfying Burke, a very a Dickensian Burke, a simple Burke. You only have to hear him speak to know he's a Burke. And look at him. There's none of the complexity of modernism in the 20th century in him. And Morgan goes on. And says, and is roaring with laughter about saying how democracy is failing in Iraq. And the audience applauds him. Hilary Benn then stands up and says, look, he's met brave men and women in Iraq who are being massacred by forces which are against everything they pretend to hold true, and he's booed. Now, it's an attempt to explain that reaction. It's an attempt to explain how we've got to this state that I've written my book. It's a history. And as I'm running out of time, if you want my explanations, you may have to wait for your questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Well done. Peter. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. It was nice to be woken up by bells in Oxford again after so many years, and to find that having slept in Christchurch before, that the rules are the same as they were when I was at Balliol, that the bed is almost as narrow as oneself, even though oneself has expanded a bit. And the motto remains, we can't stop you doing it, but we can make it very uncomfortable. Reassuring in a way. It may not be obvious to you, it might not be obvious to Nick, how I can connect my own views about the weird combination of nihilism and masochism that has spread across what was once the British Liberal left with the biography of Thomas Jefferson. But actually I can do it, and I will, trust me. I'm going to begin, though, just by saying why it is that anyone who's interested in America has to be interested in Mr. Jefferson, under at least 3 or 4 headings: the Enlightenment, the concept of nation building, and the concept of revolution, and the problem of slavery. And I'll deal with them all swiftly. You might not say that Philadelphia in the late 18th century was like 5th century Athens exactly, but you could certainly say that it was a magnet city for the Enlightenment in a global sense of the word. Not only was it associated with very famous scientists and freethinkers and innovators of the native school, Benjamin Franklin obviously being the best, the man who probably could be said to have discovered at least the uses of electricity, if not electricity itself, the applications of it, and a prodigious writer about natural philosophy, but also men like Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, who, when his laboratory in Birmingham was destroyed, smashed by a mob shouting for church and king, because of his defense of revolutionary ideas and because of his Unitarianism, took his broken instruments and the remains of his burned books and crossed the Atlantic and headed for Philadelphia, as did the greatest Englishman and the greatest American of them all, Thomas Paine, wafted across on the same tide of ideas and innovation and free thinking, with a letter in his pocket of introduction from Benjamin Franklin when he arrived. Mr. Jefferson was a very distinguished member of this group too. He helped, for example, Dr. Jenner to refine the idea of inoculation against smallpox at a time when America's leading divine, Timothy Dwight, one of the founders of Yale University,